on talkSPORT 2. Brilliant goal.
Chelsea versus Aston Villa.
Coverage 6:45. Kick-off 7 p.m. Oh, what a move. Friday night on the football station for the people. How about that? talkSPORT 2.
Good afternoon, Paul Hawksbee, Andy Jacobs here on talkSPORT. We're going to be chatting now to author David Arrowsmith. He has written Narcoball, telling the story of the grip that the drug lord Pablo Escobar had on Colombian football. He wasn't alone. Others muscled in on football as well, and it was all the poorer for it during that period, unless you were a fan of the club that Escobar bought. David, good afternoon.
Hi, gents. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, your story's an interesting one. You were just telling us off air you're half Colombian. It was a country you went to as a young kid, but come the end of the 80s, it wasn't safe to go there. Your mum was from Medellin, so you couldn't go back because it was such a dangerous place.
That's right. My mum was born in Medellin and brought up in Bogota, and I used to go back with her or with her and my father as well, but sometimes just with my mum as a small boy. And then, by the mid-80s, really, I think the last time I went, I was 7 or 8, something like that. And until very recently, about 10 years ago, I went back as well. So as an adult.
It's, I mean, these days, people, because there's still that old language, more kids, it's safe to go to Colombia. It's, Medellin these days, as you say, is a beautiful city, of vibrant, cosmopolitan
It's supposed to be a
city.
very beautiful place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping, one of the things that I was hoping with writing the book really was to gain some new fans for Colombia as a country and Colombia as a football team. And I think, a lot of people have a preconception about it. But anyone you speak to now who's been there recently, I think would tell you what an amazing time they've had and what a beautiful place it is. It has such variety of ecosystems, from beautiful beaches to the Amazon jungle to really cool modern cities. So, and the people are so welcoming because they've always wanted to banish that spectre of Escobar, which I was a bit torn with the book about retreading some of that. But I think you can only understand, history and where we've got to where we are today by looking back and seeing all those things that happened. So it's part of the story of Colombia, but sort of modern Colombia is a beautiful, wonderful place. I urge people to visit.
He was a football fan, Escobar. I mean, it wasn't just an excuse to kind of generate cash and launder cash through the club he bought and through the game. But so he did care. But so he was obsessed with football. But the uglier side of his obsession came out, didn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's what I wanted to pinpoint in the book, is that actually here is a man who, like you say, did love football. I think that's the one thing where I found a sort of commonality with him as someone else who loves football. I thought, wow, he actually clearly did love the game. Yes, whether you love football or not, if you're a billionaire, narco-terrorist, drug lord, you might think it's a good idea to launder money through, a couple of your local hometown clubs. You don't necessarily then also build football pitches in the barrios, invest in players, pioneer a strategy of growing homegrown talent for your club, transfer your manager to the national team to create a nucleus, for the national team from your team. But also, I kind of had a sort of epiphany where I realised that had I grown up somehow a billionaire narco-terrorist, would I have used some of that money to do things like smuggle Maradona into my prison to play football with me? I probably would, If you've got all the money in the world and you love football, what are you going to do?
I've never heard that story.
Yeah. Apart from the Robin Hood stuff, though, which there people who often talk about, there was, assaults, murders on referees, bribery, corruption, you name it. And a kind of... It became part of the turf war, didn't it? A rival drug dealer bought another club, and it was like the kind of machismo of it and the kudos of his team beating Escobar's team.
That's exactly right. I think it became a sort of billionaire's play thing in a way. I think we all know what that can feel like. There are a lot of parallels, I think, with what happened there and what's been happening in the wider world of football in the last few years. But yes, he took an interest in two of the Medellin clubs, Atlético Nacional and Deportivo Independiente Medellin. But then the Cali cartel, who he started out as in a partnership with, but in the end they were sort of vowed enemies. They took over America de Cali, and then the Medellin cartel, Pablo's sort of partner in crime in Medellin, who went by the name of El Mexicano, the Mexican, took over Millonarios and basically controlled Millonarios in Bogota, which is one of the biggest clubs in Colombia as well.
We were talking before we started about the ESPN documentary, which you say now you've updated the story.
Two Escobars, yeah.
The two Escobars. What was the connection between them?
So Andres Escobar was sort of the great new hope for Colombian football. He was a very stylish centre-half. On the eve of the 94 World Cup, he was about to complete signing for AC Milan. They'd been watching him since the Super Cup final against Milan that his team, Atletico Nacional, played against Milan in Tokyo and only lost in extra time. So he played for Atletico Nacional. That team was effectively bankrolled by Pablo Escobar and managed by Pacho Maturana, who was also the manager of the national team. He was one of the squeaky cleanest of the Colombian players. He was a young man, quite a religious young man from what I gather, but a really classy centre-back. And yes, what happened to him in the aftermath of 94 is part of what I was trying myself to understand in writing the book. I wanted to know for my own self and to share with the world the full context of why USA 94 went so wrong for Colombia and why Andres Escobar was killed as a result of his own goal in that tournament.
Yeah, you spoke to a lot of people, excuse me, for the book. I mean, are they still prepared to talk? You often wonder, I know he's gone and the times are different, but there is often this kind of a matter, isn't it? There's this thing of not talking about this code of silence. Did you encounter that much?
A little bit. I think it's helped by the fact that actually over the years, different people have come out to tell their side of the story. And I gathered a lot of those stories and that information in researching the book from both the Escobar family side of the story to the side of the story of the DEA agents who were hunting him down and part of the kind of team that helped end Pablo Escobar. But also the players have spoken, and they spoke both in the immediate aftermath. They spoke in films like The Two Escobars. Even René Higuita recently had quite a good documentary on Netflix. But what I found was that they all talked in little bits and kind of around some of these subjects. And in particular, I found that everywhere I looked, there was always a mention of Pablo's passion for football, but it was anecdotal and it was never the focus, and nobody ever really pulled all of that together to say, actually, from birth to death, and even the sort of spectre of his death beyond, football was a constant for him and kind of became increasingly important, not just financially, but in terms of power and gaining the support and, I think in his eyes, kind of love of a section of society that he thought would protect him, basically.
And when his days were over, he was killed. And where did this leave the clubs? Where did this leave those two clubs that he looked after? Obviously, whoever owned the club, these people had fans and players that needed to be paid and fans that cared deeply about the club.
Yes, I think in the immediate aftermath of first the death of Pablo in 1993, which came just before USA 94, then the sort of national disaster of USA 94 and the death of Andres Escobar, and then in 95 the brothers who ran the Cali cartel were finally arrested. And I think by that point the Colombian narcos, the drug lords in Colombia, realized that football was just drawing too much attention. It was a bit of a money pit as well. There were other ways to launder money. It was safer really to kind of withdraw from football. And so I think what really happened is you had this withdrawal that meant a few different things. Colombian players were no longer getting paid as much to stay in Colombia and started to look overseas, which I think in many ways benefited the development of those players and to some extent the Colombian side. But you no longer had this nucleus of domestic talent being retained. And so they travelled abroad, but there was kind of a missing generation, really. And you saw in 98 in the World Cup, Valderrama was still there. He was a bit old. He was kind of
He's who I think of when I think of Colombian football, and James Rodriguez in the modern era. But he's so distinct with that hair and everything. So.
It was an era, and this is the era of the book of great characters, great personalities, and some great players. And I'm sure your listeners will remember not just Valderrama, but also Higuita, the maverick goalkeeper. Then you've got Faustino Asprilla. He scored one of the best ever goals, that I've witnessed, not in person, unfortunately, but the goal against Argentina, the context of that goal in qualifying for the 94 World Cup when Colombia won 5-0 in Buenos Aires. So that there's some amazing players, and it's partly the story of Pablo and his love for football and how he kind of corrupted and tainted it. It's also the the story of some amazing games of football, not just for Colombia as a national side, but also the games particularly of Atlético Nacional in winning the Copa Libertadores and other football stories. I mean, it's packed with own goals, with penalties, with penalty saves, with controversial sendings off. So yeah, there's something in there for everybody.
Well,
I think.
because of Narcos and stuff, people are kind of familiar with, and the documentaries, people are familiar with Escobar's story. So this tie into football, I'm sure people would be really interested in. So Narcoball, Love, Death and Football in Escobar's Colombia by David Arrowsmith is out now, I take it, David?
It is. It's out now. Audiobook, hardback, ebook, all good booksellers.
Have you done the audiobook yourself?
I haven't. I've got a fantastic narrator who listeners might recognise. He was in House of Anubis, and he narrated the Stephen Hawking Brief History of Time audiobook. So he's like the don of audiobooks.
Okay,
so
Lovely. Good to see you, David. Wish you well with the book.
Yeah,
thank you, chaps. Lovely to be here.
David Arrowsmith there. Still to come, Jonathan Bills on commentating on the Subbuteo World Cup. An interesting gig. And the great Tony Duggan joins us. She's hung up her boots, former England forward, and we'll be having a chat with her a little bit later on.